Hello, I'm John Pye and you're watching Myths and Legends with Stoke Haunted. I'm going to tell you about the story of the death of Demetrius Mikakura and the vampire of the villas. I'm John Pye. I'm a retired police officer. In 1972, when I was 22 years old, I was called to go to number 3 The Villas in Stoke, where a man hadn't been seen for some time. He was a lodger, and his landlady reported that his door was locked and she could get no reply from him. Yeah, it was about 6 o'clock. It was Friday the 24th of November 1972. Quite dark and a little rainy. I knocked on the door of the house, an old Victorian villa, and the lady let me in, showed me upstairs to the chap's room on the landing there. The door was locked. I knocked a few times. There was no reply. I asked her permission if I could break the door open, and of course she agreed. I shouldered the door open and went inside. Well, it was dark. Fortunately, I got my torch, because when I tried the light, it wouldn't work, and the landlady explained to me that the poor chap had an obsession with things. He believed that electricity was dangerous, and he got no bulb in the room. When I shone my torch inside the room, a tiny room, I could see that there was a single bed. Just a few small pieces of furniture, bedclothes on the bed, and a mound as though there was someone in the bed. I walked over and pulled back the bed sheets, and of course there was this chap, obviously dead. There was a froth around his mouth, a congealed froth. He looked to have been dead for at least a few hours. He was very cold. And the CID were called. They had a look at it. There were some odd things about it, and that was the reason why they came to look at it. But when they satisfied themselves that there was no criminal activity involved, it was handed over to me to do the paperwork. What was strange about it was that when I'd pulled the blankets back, there were bags of powder around the body. Each one was tied with a piece of string, and other silvery parchment-like skin, which I later found out was garlic skin, and little individual pieces of garlic clove as well. I asked the landlady what this might be for, and she explained that the chap believed in vampires, and that these were his method of protecting himself. Yes, I later researched vampires. I got a book from the local library, Anthony Master's History of the Vampire, and a lot of the strange things that I found in the room were answered by some of the things I discovered in the book. Garlic, as most people will know, is supposedly a protection from vampires. Salt is apparently as well. I didn't know that. Another very strange thing is that human excrement is also supposedly a protection from vampires. If garlic is pushed into it, the vampire apparently likes to eat human excrement. doesn't sound very appetising, but that's what vampires apparently like, and it's the pieces of garlic that are pushed into it that supposedly would kill the vampire. As I looked out of the window, there was a small flat roof outside the window of the bedroom, and there was a washing bowl upturned, and when I lifted it, there was a piece of human faeces, and pushed into it along its length were pieces of garlic. So that fitted in very precisely with what I'd read in the book. It was also supposedly a serious protection to sleep with garlic in the mouth. The idea being that it would stop the vampire spirit going down the throat. When the post-mortem was carried out on Mr. Mikakura, who was the dead person, it was found that he'd choked or asphyxiated on a clove of garlic, which was stuck in his mouth. To start with, the pathologist believed it to be a pickled onion, but later examination discovered it was in fact a clove of garlic.
Well, the circumstances were these. It was reported to me as a sudden death of which the cause was unknown, and when I had the post-mortem done, the pathologist said he swallowed either a pickled onion or a clove of garlic, which I thought was rather unusual. But never mind, these things do happen. People do bolt their food and die. But I had the advantage of a very good report from a young PC in the force, which went into it very thoroughly, and it came out that this man believed in vampires and was frightened of vampires and took various precautions to stop the vampires getting at him. He had the room strewn with salt in what the PC described as a ritual fashion. He had a bag of salt between his legs, resting on his testicles. He had garlic round the room, and in addition he had outside on the windowsill an inverted bowl covering human excreta and also garlic in the middle of it. Now apparently salt and garlic are vampire repellents. He mixed salt with his urine in various containers, also outside with his excreta, garlic. The idea being apparently that the vampire would be attracted by this magnificent feed of excreta or urine and would then swallow it on the principle of the rat bait and be poisoned by the garlic. To make assurance doubly sure, he put this garlic into his mouth and unfortunately choked on it and died.
So at the age of 22, really, you had a driving force within being able to identify the path to lead down this inquiry.
Well, it sounds strange really for a 22-year-old, not much more than a boy really, should be involved in something like this, but by that time I'd already been a police officer for 3 years, and unfortunately, sadly, death was a fairly regular occurrence to me. Hardly a week would go by before without me having to deal with what we call a sudden death. Very rarely these were suspicious ones. If anything was suspicious about it, then the CID would take over if there was a criminal act involved. But every day, other deaths, of which there are many hundreds in an area like Stoke every year, would have to be looked at by the police to make sure that there was nothing wrong, and then a report would have to be formulated for the coroner, and the coroner of course would look at the report and decide if any action needed to be taken against anyone, or if anything could be done to prevent a similar sort of death in the future. So that's how it worked, and that was why death at 22 years of age was already a pretty familiar thing to me.
Having found such strange things on top of the sudden death, do you think that helped you to cope better with trying to process all the pieces of information that were coming at you?
It certainly helped me to process the information, yes, because I was probably able to do it with a fairly clear mind. The death normally would come to someone at 22 years of age as being something pretty horrific, but I had sadly become fairly used to it then, so I was doing my job, I was looking at it to try and find what had happened, and of course it was such an unusual case, it was interesting.
The anomalies in behaviour that were found in Demetrius's room, I believe it sparked an inquest, is that correct?
Yes, that's right. An inquest had to be carried out, and I think that was in February of 1973, and that took place at the coroner's court in Harts Hill. And it was Mr. Frederick Hales who was the coroner in those days, a very good coroner. He did a great deal for the community, but he was a real stickler for detail, and he was always onto the police, always onto the chief constable. I think it was the bane of the chief constable's life, because he brought about so many changes, but they were good things. And the idea of really some of the idea of an inquest is to find out if somebody's at fault, if there's been a criminal action, or if there's something that can be done to stop a similar death happening, like a road accident or work practices, things that happen in the pit, this sort of thing. So he was looking into Demetrius's death to see if there was something that could be done to prevent a similar thing. Of course there wouldn't. It was so unusual, but it was the kind of thing where he needed to have an inquest, and there needed to be a decision made on what the result was, how the accident, how the death had happened, and it did eventually culminate in a verdict of accidental death.
Anything about the case that took you by surprise, or something that in hindsight you think you could possibly have done differently, or that modern science could help do differently?
Probably not, actually. I think although it was such an interesting case and there's so many unusual features about it, it was in essence fairly straightforward. The interesting thing that came out, which was really as a result of me researching into vampires to try and get thoroughly to the bottom of it, was that when the pathologist carried out the post-mortem and discovered that he had actually asphyxiated, that he had considered that it was a pickled onion that he'd choked on. I rang him and suggested to him that he have another look at it, because it might well be a garlic clove, and of course it was, and it was only because I'd done that research that that little additional facet was found.
How was that received by the pathologist?
He was pleased. Yeah, I mean these people want to get to the truth of the matter, and I'm sure that pathologist had dealt with numerous deaths where people had choked, probably on pickled onions as well, and so it was more likely to be that. But of course we all know that a garlic clove does resemble a pickled onion, and that was what he considered it to be. And when it was not until I told him that it was possible that he looked at it, and oh yes, he was delighted. Yeah, he wanted to get to the truth of it.
It's refreshing hearing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Despite there being a hierarchy between.
Yeah, that's right. I never found that to be a problem. People genuinely wanted to get to the truth of the matter.
How old Demetrius was at this point?
I think he was in his late 50s now. I think he was 57.
I believe he had some sort of connection with the landlady. They were on familiar terms.
Yes, the landlady, Mrs. Rodzewicz, was Polish originally. She'd been in Stoke-on-Trent for 30 years, and she used her house at number 3 The Villas as a lodging house, mostly for Polish people. And she was very kind to the Polish community, and Demetrius Mikakura actually lived there rent-free, albeit it wasn't much of a room, but he didn't have to pay for it.
Fighting against obviously all the humour inside, how were you actually coping with it? Did it stick with you mentally, or did it kind of just pass you by as another sudden death?
I don't think this one ever passed me by as an ordinary sudden death, because it was so unusual, but I didn't wake up in the middle of the night screaming, no. I was pretty used to that sort of thing, although this was a very unusual case, and it stuck to me out of interest more than anything else. Yeah.
So were you happy with the verdict?
It was accurate, yeah.
It
Sure, it was accurate, yeah.
Did you feel like you were able to put the case to bed then?
Yeah, I'm sure that that was the right outcome. That was what had happened. The only strange thing about it was that he'd got a mark on his wrist, which a small red mark, which could have come from anything, or any sort of little accident or incident, but the coroner was very interested to know what this might have been, in case it could have been something to do with vampires, but the pathologist was satisfied that it was just a graze, some sort of a small accident he'd had some time before he died.
Yes, I did notice in the reports that he had the abrasion to the left wrist.
That's right, yeah.
And one of my questions originally, before seeing the paperwork, just was how fresh that abrasion actually was.
It was quite fresh, yeah. There was dried blood on it, so it hadn't scabbed over. It was, it was probably within a few hours of him dying, I would have thought. Yeah, fairly soon.
Right. So it just adds to the area.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
where do you see yourself going now with regards to any more research or looking into any more different avenues?
Well, I'm writing now, and I did write a short story on the Demetrius case, which is called The Vampire of the Villas, and I've written a book on a mostly humorous account of my own police service. I'm now writing crime fiction, and that's my interest really. I can't see myself as writing any horror stories. No, this is just one incident that happened to me, and it was interesting, and it'll follow me around forever.
I suppose your niche is with the police force at
Yeah,
the end of the day.
That's right. Yeah.
And how long did you serve as?
26 years. Yeah.
26 years. And what ranking did you?
I finished as detective inspector.
So you got quite high up the ladder, really. With all the research that you've done, would you consider yourself to the point of being an expert in this field?
No, I don't think so, no. There's a lot of things have changed and ideas have changed, and I wouldn't put myself up as being a vampire expert. I'm a person who's been involved in this incident, and as a result I've become interested in it, and I've read up on it and found out some unusual things, but I'm no expert, no.
Did it lead you down any other paranormal fields or opportunities?
I've always been very sceptical about it, but I've always found it very interesting. Sometimes you hear of strange incidents, and there's no apparent solution to it. So it is interesting. I don't believe in ghosts, but it's an interesting subject, and sometimes there's no answer to it.
So sometimes, as you say, there's no rhyme or reason.
That's right, yeah, absolutely.
That
Yes, I mean, there was always a lot of humour involved in the police force, camaraderie, and sometimes if the pressure was bad or an awful incident, then some black humour had come out, and it was a defence mechanism, I suppose, to get over it. But yeah, I had the Mickey take note of me, especially with my name being Pye. I was called Van Pye, and one or two other things, yeah. I can't think of everything now, but there were some nicknames that floated around, and people said that were asking if I got garlic for tea and things like that. Yeah, so there was a lot of jokes that went along with it. Yeah.
And you took them in good humour.
Oh, of course, yeah, absolutely. You've got to do, yeah.
Need a little bit of light relief
Yeah.
every now and then.
That's right, yeah. Well, the public took it seriously, without a doubt, because it generated such a lot of interest. It was a really interesting story. In the job in the police force, the attitude towards vampires and me would clash. Sometimes if somebody would say that they'd been to see a horror film the night before, and of course my name cropped up, this sort of thing. But it was just an interesting, unusual case, and of course it generated a great deal of interest, and it was something that followed me around and still follows me around to this day. I was asked to go on the television a few times, but of course the chief constable of the day was Arthur Rees, who was very guarded about it, and he was a Welshman, and told me that he didn't like his police officers being associated with vampires.